Well, we have a satellite in outer space, a WMAP, that has forced us to rewrite all the textbooks on cosmology. We physicists thought we knew it all, that the universe is made out of atoms. The old picture was that the universe is some kind of soap bubble. This is a picture given to us by Albert Einstein. And the soap bubble, well, it's expanding slowly, but it's slowing down. And we're like flies trapped on fly paper. We can't leave our soap bubble. That's the old picture. The WMAP satellite has forced us to throw out all this and introduce a whole new set of facts. First of all, the soap bubble is not slowing down. It is speeding up. It is out of control. It's expanding so rapidly that it could force a premature death of the universe. But this is the real killer now. This is what's causing so much excitement in the world of physics. We now believe there could be other soap bubbles out there in other universes, that the old concept of a universe, a one universe, is being replaced by a multiverse, and satellite data is leading the way. Now, we could be on the cusp of a new Copernican revolution. Copernicus introduced the idea that the Earth is not the center of all there is, that the sun was the center of the solar system. In this new Copernican revolution, our universe is not necessarily the only game in town. That there could be other soap bubbles, that soap bubbles can fission in half, like bud, sprout baby soap bubbles.
Baby universes.
Baby universes. That's right. And Stephen Hawking has even written about these baby universes. What would they be like if we met one of these baby universes? And speculation is now turned into hard fact, because in 6 years' time now, a new satellite is going up into orbit called LISA, Laser Interferometry Space Antenna, which could nail it to the wall. LISA could give us, now get this, LISA could give us baby pictures of the instant of creation itself. Now think about it. The baby universe emerging from the womb, that's what we hope to get out of LISA. And some of us are betting, some of us physicists are putting money on the table, believing that when we get these baby pictures of the instant of creation, that maybe there'll be an umbilical cord connecting our universe to a parent universe.
Because we were a bubble off a previous universe.
That's right. And maybe our universe has given birth to other baby universes.
So another umbilical cord going another way.
That's right.
Now, people already will be thinking of this and thinking, well, this is physics? This is surely not physics. You're first of all rewriting the English language. No longer universe doesn't mean everything, it just means part of everything. And then secondly, you're rewriting how we think about God, theology, the religion, what the whole purpose of life is.
That's right. If you really think about the multiverse idea, it's staggering in its philosophical and theological scope. For example, when I was a child, I used to go to Sunday school and learn in the Presbyterian Church all about the moment of Genesis. And it was such a thrilling story, this man saying, "Let there be light." But you know, my parents are Buddhists, and in Buddhism, there is no Genesis. There's nirvana. Nirvana is timeless. There's no beginning, and there's no end. So for all these years, I had these two mutually exclusive ideas in my head. And how can I reconcile these? Well, now I'm a physicist at the cutting edge of something called string theory, which we can talk about later. But now I realize that the multiverse idea gives this wonderful blend, this melding of these two religious thinking, that Genesis takes place continually in an ocean of nirvana. That these bubbles are sprouting out of nirvana, and this nirvana is something we call 11-dimensional hyperspace. It is a much larger space that our soap bubble is expanding into. And so we have a beautiful melding of a timeless nirvana giving birth to multiple Genesises.
Well, we'll come on to some of the details in a moment. I just wondered, though, whether when you talked about it's like Copernicus saying that the Earth isn't the way we thought of it before, and that the sun doesn't go round us, it's the other way around, and these religious examples, you sound like a heretic. And heretics get burned at the stake. We don't believe you. You're upsetting the natural order.
Well, in 1600, Giordano Bruno, a former Catholic priest, was burned alive by the Catholic Church for saying precisely these things. He talked about parallel worlds in outer space, other suns, and what could be more innocent than the idea of alien civilizations out there in the heavens? But think about it. If you do believe in these parallel worlds in space, the Church would say to itself, is there a Pope? Is there a
Parallel
Trinity?
Pope.
Is there a parallel Christ? Is there a parallel saints? How many saints are there in outer space? How many popes? Which pope has religious jurisdiction over any other pope? The mind goes crazy thinking about the religious implications of parallel worlds, so the church simply burned them alive.
Explain, because one of the most difficult concepts to grasp in your book is this question of parallel worlds and where they are, where these other dimensions are. Everybody knows something is wide and tall and understands the concept of time, but where's this parallel universe?
They're actually in our living room. When I was a child growing up outside San Francisco, I used to look at the carp in the Japanese tea garden. I used to spend hours imagining what would it be like to live in two dimensions. A very shallow pond, fish could swim forward, backward, left, right, their eyes were to the side, but the concept of up into the third dimension, up into hyperspace, made no sense to any fish. And I imagined a scientist there saying, bah, humbug. Anyone who talks about the world of up is talking science fiction. And then I imagined as a child grabbing this fish scientist, lifting the fish scientist into hyperspace, where the fish scientist would see other ponds, parallel ponds, beings moving without fins, beings breathing without water, that is us, a new law of physics. Now, H.G. Wells, in his novel, The Invisible Man, no one ever reads it carefully to find out how H.G. Wells envisioned invisibility. He envisioned it through the fourth dimension. If I have two parallel sheets of paper, like two ponds, I have us in one universe, but I have another one hovering, just hovering inches above our universe. Light goes underneath the invisible man, so he is invisible, but he can look down on us. So we think that anyone in a higher dimension could be visible to us via its gravity. Gravity does seep across universes.
So by being visible because of its gravity, there may be a way of proving that this theory is more than just a theory.
That's right, and believe it or not, the Hubble Space Telescope over the last several years has been giving us maps of something called dark matter. Dark matter makes up most of the universe. It's not made out of atoms. Your chemistry teacher was wrong in saying that the universe is mainly made out of atoms.
You are going to get burned at the stake, I can see, with all the chemistry. Anyway, go on.
These are the whole generations of textbooks have now had to be thrown out. The universe is not mainly made out of atoms. We are talking about dark matter. It's invisible. You cannot photograph dark matter. We know it's there because of its gravitational presence. The Hubble Space Telescope has indirectly given us maps, gorgeous maps of dark matter pervading the galaxy. Well, some of us believe that we are actually tracing out the outlines of the invisible man, invisible galaxies, invisible worlds hovering just above our universe. Invisible because light goes beneath it, but we feel the effects of its gravity, which hops across universes.
Which can be measured. But then,
but
then, if that is true, at some point, some scientists somewhere will find a parallel universe, will they not? And they are searching for it.
We think that, first of all, you can detect a parallel universe in several ways. First of all, how does a parallel universe form? Everybody knows that when matter falls into a black hole, it disappears. But, you know, even children ask the question of their parents, gee, Daddy, if all that matter falls into a black hole, where does it go?
Which is a good question.
Some of us believe that it's blown out the other end, that it goes through the kitchen sink, but then it's blown out into a white hole. Now, a white hole emits matter rather than swallowing it up. A white hole expands very rapidly to accommodate all this new matter flowing into it. And hey, doesn't that sound like the Big Bang? Doesn't that sound like Genesis itself? Our universe could be a white hole. A white hole expanding rapidly with matter flowing into it, connected by an umbilical cord to perhaps a parent universe.
I want to talk a bit about the impact on humanity and ordinary people, but can you see why, to many people listening to this, it is almost as if theoretical physics has become a new priesthood? Because you can make the calculations, you speak this, you're translating your technical language for the benefit of all of us, and we have to take it on trust that you've got it right, and this theory, perhaps, may be the right one.
Well, a priesthood is not accountable to anything but its own inner logic. We are accountable to the laws of nature. We have the WMAP satellite up in orbit right now, forcing us to rewrite a whole generation of textbooks that said that there's only one universe, that there's only atoms that make up the visible universe. That's the old thing that's been replaced by the WMAP satellite. And in 6 years, as I mentioned, LISA goes up in orbit, and again, LISA could disprove this. The Laser Interferometry Satellite. 3 satellites connected by laser beams making a triangle. The triangle is 3 million miles across, making it the largest satellite system ever conceived of by the human mind, to be launched in 2011. And it'll detect shock waves from the instant of the Big Bang. And if the shock waves don't come out right, if the frequency of vibrations that LISA picks up does not correspond to our theories go out the window.
And however, you have to start again.
However, if they confirm it, this could be the greatest revolution in philosophy since the Copernican revolution.
Michio, extra dimensions is front and center in the scientific world. No longer just science fiction. I want to understand how it works in string theory, in fundamental physics, and then potentially in cosmology in large extra dimensions. How significant is this in our understanding?
Let me tell you a story. When I was a child growing up in San Francisco area, I used to visit the Japanese tea garden and to visit the carp swimming just beneath the lily pads in a 2-dimensional pond. I used to spend hours looking at them. They would swim forward, backward, left and right. Their eyes were to the side, and they couldn't see me. I was in the 3rd dimension. I was in hyperspace. They were totally unaware that there was a universe beyond their pond. And then I thought, well, what happens if I reach down and grab one of the fish, lift the fish up? Maybe that fish was a scientist, and the scientist would say, bah, humbug, science fiction, there's no world of up. Up does not exist. Well, I would grab this scientist, lift them up in the world of up, hyperspace, the 3rd dimension. What would he see? He would see beings breathing without water, a new law of biology. Beings moving without fins, a new law of physics. And then I would put the fish back into the pond. What kind of stories would he tell? Well, today, we physicists believe, we cannot prove it yet, but we are the fish. We spend all our life in 3 dimensions. We go forward, backward, left, right, up, down, thinking that anything beyond our pond, anything beyond our little puny universe is science fiction. We say, bah, humbug. We can't say that anymore because the concept of higher dimensions now is the biggest game in town. You see, in 3 dimensions, there's not enough room to put all the laws of physics. But when you go to this larger pond, this pond of hyperspace, then all the laws of physics just fit together like a jigsaw puzzle.
In our 3 dimension, the laws of physics are there, we can explain things, but there are lots of pieces that seem to be random, that you have to enter constants by hand, and so you might have 30 or so constants of physics and more in cosmology, and they look like they all have nothing to do with one another.
That's right. I like to think of a crystal. Let's say a crystal, a beautiful crystal, shatters and lands on a tabletop. And they're little insect-like flatlanders living on this tabletop. And they say, let us reassemble the crystal. Well, they bring it together, and then they have one crystal. It's called the quantum theory. They assemble other pieces of the crystal. It's called relativity, theory of space-time. But then they try to bring these 2 chunks together, and they cannot. No matter how they bring these chunks together, they cannot. And then one day, someone says, let us go to the world of up. Let us move one crystal up and then fit it into the 3rd dimension, and it will create a beautiful unified crystal. That's where we are today, we think. We live in a 3-dimensional world. We see pieces. We see the electromagnetic force. We see gravity. We see nuclear force. Little pieces of this unified field theory. We bring them together. Now we have the theory of the quantum theory, the theory of the small, the theory of atoms. We have the theory of Einstein, the theory of space, time, relativity, but they don't fit together until you go into hyperspace, and then they fit together beautifully.
So when they fit together, what does that mean? We now learn that we need 10 or 11 dimensions, only 3 of which, or 4 if you include time, that we have, and so there are as many as 6 smaller dimensions, and what's happening in those dimensions? Why do you need 6 in string theory?
Well, today we see the world as very broken. We see pieces of it. But at the beginning of time, when the universe was first created, that's when the crystal existed in its perfect form. We call it the superforce. A single superforce held this crystal together, but then we had the Big Bang, which shattered this crystal, giving us the shattered universe of today. When you look around you and you see the different forces, mountains, clouds, planets, it's broken. We live in a horribly broken world. But at the instant of creation, there was perfection. There was perfection in a higher dimension. This perfection cannot exist in 3 dimensions. Now, some people say, well, why 10? Why 11? Well, it turns out that there are certain magic numbers in mathematics, and numbers which have spectacular properties. It turns out that if you go to a 13-dimensional universe, a 15-dimensional universe, it's unstable. Particles would prefer to collapse down to 10 or 11 dimensions because the mathematics shows that self-consistency is important. They're unstable. Universes in 29 dimensions are simply unstable.
And so the mathematics has shown that we need 10 or 11 dimensions, including the 3 we see, to make stability. And so the simplest forces or strings can then emerge in our 3-dimensional world in the particles and forces that we normally see.
That's right. So in this crystal, the crystal exists in a higher dimension, but it eventually cracked apart for reasons that we are still trying to understand. And the 3-dimensional world we see today is quite broken. Now, where are these higher dimensions? Look at smoke. Smoke permeates throughout a room. Smoke permeates in all 3 dimensions, but smoke never disappears. Smoke never floats into the 4th dimension. Therefore, a 4th, 5th, 6th dimension has to be smaller than smoke. But atoms also don't suddenly drift away into hyperspace. Therefore, these higher dimensions have to be smaller than an atom, or else our universe would float away. Okay? So we think that at the beginning of time, there was this perfection of 10 or 11 dimensional hyperspace, but these other dimensions curled up, so small that atoms cannot leak into these higher dimensions.
So these are the kinds of that look from a distance as if they're one-dimensional, but when you get very, very, very small on scales that are much, much smaller than an atom, they actually would curl around each other and be like a straw.
That's right. So that the universe we see around us really is hyperdimensional, but we can't see it because these other dimensions have curled up. They're too small to be observed.
Compactification is the word that I think string theorists use.
That's right. If I have a tabletop exists in 2 dimensions, but I can roll it up like in a cigarette, roll it up, and then I see this 1-dimensional thing, which is actually 2-dimensional if I get very close with a microscope. So we think that these higher dimensions are all around you, in your body, in your living room. The pond touches the 3rd dimension at every point. So if I have a pond and we are the fish swimming in the pond, and you ask the fish, where is the 3rd dimension? The answer is everywhere.
All right, now we have, that's on the microscopic scale. What about large extra dimensions that seem to be talked about now in some theories of cosmology?
Well, strings can only vibrate in 10 dimensions, but in the 90s there was a revolution that it turns out that if you add an 11th dimension, one more dimension, then membranes can exist. Not just little strings, but beach balls and golf balls can vibrate. And perhaps our universe is a membrane, in which case perhaps some of these dimensions could be large, perhaps even infinite. So once you go from the 10-dimensional world of strings, where these dimensions are very tiny, and go to an 11 dimensions, then you're talking about a whole new picture, a picture whereby some of these dimensions could be huge. And that may even explain why gravity is so weak. Gravity is a very weak force. Perhaps gravity oozes, escapes into these higher dimensions, and that's why gravity is so weak.
This so-called hierarchy problem, which gravity may be 10 to the 39th or 10 to the 40th times smaller than the electromagnetic force. It seems that these two are fundamental forces. To have such a vast difference in scale doesn't seem to make sense.
That's right. I could put sheets of paper on the table, comb my hair, and you do this in elementary school, pick up the sheets of paper. Well, I just defied gravity. The Earth weighs 6 trillion kilograms. I defied 6 trillion kilograms with a comb by picking up pieces of paper with the electric force. That's how weak gravity is. And perhaps these higher dimensions is due to the fact that space oozes, gravity oozes into these higher dimensions.
Now, these, if we look at the possibility of these large extra dimensions, which you said might be infinite in size, are we limited to these extra 6 or 7 dimensions other than the 3 we see, or might there be a vast number of infinite number of dimensions, as well as each one being infinite in size? How many infinities are we dealing with here?
Well, we think that 11 is the upper limit. Some people actually have looked at 12 dimensions. In 12 dimensions, we have 2 times. But in 13 dimensions, the universe becomes really unstable. I've looked at 13. It's a horrible dimension to work with mathematically. 12 seems to be the limit. And even in 12 dimensions, you have double times.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that.
Right. But one thing is maybe we can experimentally see some of these objects, because if a universe is hovering just above you, it is invisible to you. Light goes underneath. And that may explain dark matter. Dark matter is invisible. It has gravity. The Hubble Space Telescope has given us maps of this invisible matter. Maybe it's nothing but an ordinary galaxy hovering just above us in another dimension. If you read H.G. Wells' famous novel, The Invisible Man, he becomes invisible because he's blown into the 4th dimension. He's hovering just above us. Light goes underneath the invisible man, but he can look down on us. So perhaps dark matter, which makes up most of the matter of the universe, is nothing but ordinary matter of a galaxy hovering in a parallel universe just above us.
Under the thinking, gravity then being the only kind of force that can transmit in some way between different dimensions. It's the one thing that different dimensions are permeable to would be gravity. Everything else can't penetrate it, but gravity can.
That's right. We are like flies on flypaper. The flypaper represents our universe. We're stuck. We can't get off. But gravity oozes between flypapers, and therefore we can actually perhaps detect experimentally the presence of alternate universes. This is not just science fiction. Perhaps with our instruments, we can detect dark matter-like objects from other universes hovering just above our universe, because gravity oozes between dimensions.
Yes, I would second all these words. These are words of wisdom. However, there are some naysayers who say that, well, there's a dangerous world out there. It's a dangerous world with rogue nations. Yes, there are rogue nations, principal among them perhaps the United States of America. It's a dangerous world, they say. In other words, we have to have peace through strength. That's what they say. Well, I say we have to have strength through peace. Now, strength through peace, what does that mean? That means that in the 21st century, you are strong if you have a vibrant economy, if you have much discussions of civil liberties and human rights, if you have vigorous civic life and democratic discussions and a vibrant economy. That is true strength. And it's not strength through war, it is strength that comes through peace. However, there are some naysayers. First of all, they say it's not possible. Human nature, they say, will not tolerate this. Well, look at the situation in Japan. There's some people here from Japan. And in Japan, there is a culture of peace. In the United States, in order to get elected, you have to show how tough you are. You have to show what a great He-Man you are to get elected in the United States. In Japan, sometimes it's the opposite. In Japan, the center of gravity is for peace. You have to show you're for peace in order to get elected, and many times in Japan. There's a different culture there. So it's not human nature. We have examples. We have examples of nations that don't have a culture of war, that have, in turn, a culture of peace. And so why is it, therefore, that the American people vote for a president with a tremendous military budget? Well, the number one issue in the country right now is Social Security. And the one question that everyone's asking right now is, there's no money. There's no money. What about health care? There's no money. There's no money. Well, what I'm telling you now is there's plenty of money. It happens to go to the Pentagon. We have a huge Pentagon budget. But then people say peace through strength. In other words, the politicians have to not only take credit for the past, but they also have to show how menacing the future is. My point of view is the politicians will fight progressive change with every tooth and fiber in their body until they realize that it's inevitable, then they take credit for it. So therefore, what is it about the politicians that make good, well-meaning Americans, peaceful, loving Americans, vote for a huge Pentagon budget in spite of all the rhetoric that there's no money for health care, there's no money for Social Security? Well, I think you know the reason. The politicians tend to play with the truth a little bit. And in fact, I have, as a physicist, I have a foolproof test. I tested it out last night on the evening news to tell when President Bush is lying. It works every time. As a president, I know that, as a physicist, I know the test is, if his lips move, you know he's lying. So if you look at public opinion then, so what is it about public opinion? What about the American people? Do they like war or do they like peace? Several years ago, I wrote a book called To Win a Nuclear War, and I had the chance to go through the archives of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They are some of the most secret documents in the post-war era. I had a chance to go through our war plans, the minutes of the meetings. And during the Korean War, it was quite interesting. During the Korean War, we know that President Eisenhower had plans to drop the atomic bomb on North Korea. It was called Oplan 852. I even have a copy of the atomic annex of Oplan 852. And in Oplan 852, in the atomic annex, we have targets to be vaporized with the use of nuclear weapons. We have minutes of one meeting where Eisenhower goes to the map. He goes to the map and selectively selects targets where nuclear weapons will be used. But then there's a debate in his cabinet, a debate with the National Security Council. There are voices, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, being the primary one, saying that we have to use nuclear weapons. And then other people say the American people are not ready. So Eisenhower decides to go to the press, and he decides to test the waters. And he makes his famous bombs are bullets speech. It's in the history books. President Eisenhower says that we have to get used to the idea that atomic bombs are like bullets. We use bullets all the time, and it's about time we got used to the idea that atomic bombs are no different than bullets. Well, the next day, I have the minutes of the meeting. The next day, there was a flood of telegrams coming into the White House saying, "Are you crazy? Have you gone out of your mind?" Adlai Stevenson, we have his telegram saying, "You've lost it. Atomic bombs are like bullets." And then I also have the minutes of the meeting that took place after that. Eisenhower comes out and says, "You cannot," he says, "as a former general, I know you cannot fight a war when half your people want peace. You cannot fight a war holding up all these telegrams where the American people will not tolerate the use of nuclear weapons." What's the lesson here? The lesson here is that the will of the people, even the politicians have to listen to that. And that's why we're here today. That's why we have to mobilize. That's why we have to keep the spirit of Upton Sinclair alive and well. And just remember that we have minor victories all the time. Last month, the Navajo people voted to ban all uranium mining on one of the largest uranium reservations in the continental United States. They voted. I should also point out that the Brookhaven National Laboratory had a document issued years ago stating that certain areas, Native American lands, should be declared a national sacrifice area to preserve the nuclear fuel cycle. Think about that. Native American lands declared a national sacrifice area. I think we should declare the Pentagon a national sacrifice area. And then the military has another document. It should be required reading. It's called Vision for 2020. It's on the web. Maybe you've seen it already. I paraphrase the Vision for 2020 of the U.S. Space Command. The head of the U.S. Space Command is now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In it, it summarizes the last 2,000 years of world history. Why did Rome dominate the world? Because its engineers controlled good roads. Good roads meant good logistics, by which you can fight wars with tremendous logistical rapidity and flexibility. The Romans had good engineers. They controlled the land. And then why did the great powers of the 1800s, how come they ruled the world? How come the sun never set on the British Empire? Because they controlled the oceans. They had gunboat diplomacy. They control the oceans, rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. And then the future belongs to the nation that controls the next frontier, space. So now you know why there's no money. There's plenty of money. It's all going up in a Star Wars program that don't work. In other words, the military is planning for New Rome. That's the catchword among conservatives these days. Talk to any conservative, and they'll talk gleefully about New Rome. My attitude is, what happened to old Rome? It fell. And why did it fall? Because of imperial overreach. President Kennedy, Professor Kennedy at Yale wrote a book about this and analyzed the fall of the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire. Why did all these empires rise and fall? Empires, he said, rise and fall in 3 stages. The first stage, stage 1, is when you have a vibrant economy. Rome at the juncture of 2 great rivers. London with its access to the British Channel. A vibrant economy is stage 1. Stage 2, the empire is not just content to trade with markets, they want to control them militarily. Rome declares war on Carthage. Rome becomes an empire and starts to take over its neighboring lands. That's stage 2. Then there's stage 3. Stage 3 is imperial overreach. The military is spread so thin, so widely, that it corrupts the economy. It corrupts the spirit of the people. The people begin to bicker. The economy begins to fluctuate and eventually starts to decline. The goose that laid the golden egg, the economy, starts to get devoured by the war machine. And let me ask you a question. What stage are we in? Think about that. And let me end on one last note. Like I said before, there are small victories everywhere we go. The Navajo people have stood up. You also heard that a few months ago, the Canadian people decided to pull out of the Star Wars program. They saw a system that don't work. They realized that a ton of money is going to be wasted. They decided to pull out of the Star Wars program, even though the Canadian government has publicly voiced support for the Star Wars program. They put their ear to the ground, and the Canadian people said, no Star Wars. And that means less money, less initiative for the Star Wars program. And then let me just end on one last note. Of course, we do want a peace department that will hopefully study history the way it should be studied. According to Seymour Hersh of the New York Times, we know that President Nixon had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. That's why he got elected. According to Seymour Hersh, we know what that plan was. It was called Operation Duck Hook. The plan to drop 2 atomic bombs on North Korea in November of 1969. Operation Duck Hook was in 2 volumes, a blue cover for Volume 1 and Volume 2, with a jet aircraft taking off the surface of an aircraft carrier. Volume 2 had the atomic annex. In Volume 2, the appendix had the photographs of the sites where the 2 atomic bombs would be dropped near the border between North Korea and China. Many people have seen Operation Duck Hook and have since commented to the press about Nixon's secret plan to end the war in Vietnam in November of 1969. So why didn't he drop the bomb? Because in October of '69, 2 weeks before the November ultimatum, there were 250,000 people marching in the streets of Washington, D.C., saying, peace now, give peace a chance. And 2 weeks later, there was a second demonstration, sandwiching the November ultimatum, another 250,000 people. And according to Nixon's memoirs, he doesn't mention the atomic annex, but he says, quote, I could not execute the November ultimatum because he feared that these people would not be content to march outside the White House lawn. They'd march inside the White House lawn instead. The point I'm raising is something very simple, and that is there's one power more powerful than a hydrogen bomb. There's one thing more powerful than all our nuclear weapons, and that is the will of the people. And if we can tap into the will of people, then we too could have a culture of peace, we too could have a peace department, and we too could then make sure that our swords are turned into plowshares. Thank you.
To discuss the situation in Japan, as well as his latest book, we're joined by Dr. Michio Kaku, a Japanese-American physicist, a best-selling author, professor of theoretical physics at City University of New York and the City College of New York. His brand new book is Physics of the Future, How Science Will Change Daily Life by 2100. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to see you again.
Glad to be on the show, Amy.
So, talk about this raising of the category level to 7 on a par with Chernobyl.
Well, Tokyo Electric has been in denial, trying to downplay the full impact of this nuclear accident. However, there's a formula, a mathematical formula by which you can determine what level this accident is. This accident has already released something on the order of 50,000 trillion becquerels of radiation. You do the math. That puts it right smack in the middle of a level 7 nuclear accident. Still less than Chernobyl. However, radiation is continuing to leak out of the reactors. The situation is not stable at all. So you're looking at basically a ticking time bomb. It appears stable, but the slightest disturbance, a secondary earthquake, a pipe break, evacuation of the crew at Fukushima, could set off a full-scale meltdown at 3 nuclear power stations, far beyond what we saw at Chernobyl.
Talk about exactly, I mean, as a physicist, to explain to people exactly what has taken place in Japan at these nuclear power plants.
Think of driving a car, and the car all of a sudden lunges out of control. You hit the brakes. The brakes don't work. That's because the earthquake wiped out the safety systems in the first minute of the earthquake and tsunami. Then your radiator starts to heat up and explodes. That's the hydrogen gas explosion. And then to make it worse, the gas tank is heating up, and all of a sudden your whole car is going to be in flames. That's the full-scale meltdown. So what do? You drive the car into a river. That's what the utility did by putting seawater from the Pacific Ocean in a desperate attempt to keep water on top of the core. But then seawater has salt in it, and that gums up your radiator. And so what do? You call out the local firemen. And so now you have these Japanese samurai warriors. They know that this is potentially a suicide mission. They're coming in with hose water, trying to keep water over the melted nuclear reactor cores. So that's the situation now. So when the utility says that things are stable, it's only stable in the sense that you're dangling from a cliff, hanging by your fingernails, and as the time goes by, each fingernail starts to crack. That's the situation now.
What about the food, the level of contamination of the food? They're increasingly banning food exports.
The tragedy is this accident has released enormous quantities of iodine, radioactive iodine-131, into the atmosphere, like what happened at Chernobyl, about 10% the level of Chernobyl. Iodine is water-soluble. When it rains, it gets into the soil. Cows then eat the vegetation, create milk, and then it winds up in the milk. Farmers are now dumping milk right on their farms because it's too radioactive.
Foods have to be impounded in the area. And let's be blunt about this. Would you buy food that says made in Chernobyl? And the Japanese people are also saying, what, should I buy food that says made in Fukushima? We're talking about the collapse of the local economy. Just because the government tries to lowball all the numbers, downplay the severity of the accident, and that's making it much worse.
What do you think has to be done now? I mean, one of the biggest problems is secrecy, both with the Tokyo company that runs the plants and also the government, the constant downplaying from the beginning. And yet there are so many people who have been evacuated who are demanding compensation. There was just a major protest at TEPCO with the people in the area who've been evacuated, no jobs, no money, saying we demand compensation.
Well, TEPCO is like the little Dutch boy. All of a sudden, we have cracks in the dike. You put a finger here, you put a finger there, and all of a sudden, new leaks start to occur, and they're overwhelmed. I suggest that they be removed from leadership entirely and be put as consultants. An international team of top physicists and engineers should take over with the authority to use the Japanese military. I think the Japanese military is the only organization capable of bringing this raging accident under control. And that's what Gorbachev did in 1986. He saw this flaming nuclear power station in Chernobyl. He called out the Red Air Force. He called out helicopters, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and buried the Chernobyl reactor in 5,000 tons of cement, sand, and boric acid. That's, of course, a last-ditch effort, but I think the Japanese military should be called out.
To do?
Because of the fact that the radiation levels are so great, workers can only go in for perhaps 10 minutes, 15 minutes at a time, and they get their year's dose of radiation. You're there for 1 hour, and you have radiation sickness. You vomit, your white corpuscle count goes down, your hair falls out. You're there for a day, and you get a lethal amount of radiation. At Chernobyl, there were 600,000 people mobilized, each one going in for just a few minutes, dumping sand, concrete, boric acid onto the reactor site. Each one got a medal. That's what it took to bring one raging nuclear accident under control. And I think the utility here is simply outclassed and overwhelmed.
And yet these workers are in for much longer periods of time.
That's right. And we don't even know how much radiation levels they're getting because many areas around the site have no monitors. So we don't even know how much radiation many of these workers are getting. And that's why I'm saying if you have access to the military, you can have the option of sandbagging the reactor, encasing it in concrete, or at least have a reserve of troops that can go in for brief periods of time and bring this monster under control.
What about the evacuation zone? Is it big enough?
It's pathetic. The United States government has already stated 50 miles for evacuating U.S. personnel. The French government has stated that all French people should consider leaving the entire islands. And here we are with the government talking about 6 miles, 10 miles, 12 miles. And the people there are wondering, what's going on with the government? I mean, why aren't they telling us the truth? Radiation levels are now rising 25 miles from the site, far beyond the evacuation zone. And remember that we could see an increase in leukemia. We could see an increase in thyroid cancers. That's the inevitable consequence of releasing enormous quantities of iodine into the environment.
What has to happen to the plant ultimately?
Well, in the best case scenario, this is the scenario devised by the utility itself. They hope to bring it under control by the end of this year. By the end of this year, they hope to have the pumps working and the reaction is finally stabilized by the end of this year.
Oddly, it's sounding a little bit like BP when they were trying to plug up the hole.
Right.
It will happen, it will happen.
They're literally making it up as they go along. We're in totally uncharted territories. You get any nuclear engineering book, look at the last chapter, and this scenario is not contained in the last chapter of any nuclear engineering textbook on the planet Earth. So they're making it up as they go along. And we are the guinea pigs for this science experiment that's taking place. Then it could take up to 10 years to finally dismantle the reactor. The last stage is entombment. This is now the official recommendation of Toshiba, that they entomb the reactor over a period of many years, similar to what happened in Chernobyl.
Entomb it in?
In a gigantic slab of concrete. You're going to have to drill underneath to make sure that the core does not melt right into the ground table. And you're going to put 5,000 tons of concrete and sand on top of the flaming reactor.
Should people be concerned about any food that says from Japan?
Not from Japan, but remember, in the area, the sea, we're talking about levels that are millions of times beyond legal levels found right there. However, as you start to get out further, radiation levels drop rather considerably.
I wanted to talk about policy in this country. I mean, we are now seeing happening in Japan this horrific event. Japan was the target of the dawn of the nuclear age, right? The U.S. dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Your own family mirrors the history of the nuclear age. Can you talk just briefly about that before we talk about current U.S. policy?
Yeah, first of all, I have relatives in Tokyo, and they're wondering about evacuation. In fact, some of my relatives have already evacuated from Tokyo. They have little radiation has already appeared in the drinking water in Tokyo. And so people are wondering, you know, especially for young children, for pregnant women, should they leave? People are voting with their feet now. A lot of people are voluntarily evacuating from Tokyo because they simply don't believe the statements of the utility, which have consistently lowballed all the estimates of radiation damage.
And though in the past, in terms of your own family's history, your parents being interned in the Japanese-American internment camps.
That's right. In California, my parents were interned in the relocation camps from 1942 to 1946. 4 years where they were put essentially behind barbed wire and machine guns under the supervision of the United States military.
And yet you became a nuclear physicist, interestingly enough, and you worked with the people who made the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan.
Yeah, in fact, my high school advisor was Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. And he arranged for me to get a scholarship to Harvard, in fact, and that began my career as a nuclear scientist. Now, Edward Teller, of course, wanted me to work on the Star Wars program. He put a lot of pressure and said, look, we'll give you fellowships, scholarships, go to Los Alamos National Laboratory, Livermore National Laboratory, design hydrogen bombs. But I said no. I said I cannot see my expertise being used to advance the cause of war.
And you've been very outspoken when it comes to nuclear power in the United States. This, of course, has raised major issues about nuclear power plants around the world. Many countries saying they're not moving forward. President Obama is taking the opposite position. He really is very much the nuclear renaissance man. He is talking about a nuclear renaissance and has not backed off, in fact reiterated, saying this will not stop us from building the first nuclear power plants in what? Decades.
Well, there's something called the Faustian bargain. Faust was this mythical figure who sold his soul to the devil for unlimited power. Now, the Japanese government has thrown the dice with the Faustian bargain. Japan has very little fossil fuel reserves, no hydroelectric power to speak of, and so they went nuclear. However, in the United States, we're now poised at this key juncture in history where the government has to decide whether to go to the next generation of reactors. These are the so-called gas-cooled pebble bed reactors, which are safer than the current design, but they still melt down. The proponents of this new renaissance say that you can go out to dinner and basically have a leisurely conversation even as your reactor melts down. But it still melts. That's the bottom line.
And so what do you think should happen? Do you think nuclear power plants should be built in this country?
I think there should be a national debate, a national debate about a potential moratorium. The American people have not been given the full truth because, for example, right north of New York City, roughly 30 miles north of where we are right now, we have the Indian Point nuclear power plant, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has now admitted that of all the reactors prone to earthquakes, the one right next to New York City is #1 on that list. And the government itself, back in 1980, estimated that property damage would be on the order of about $200 billion in case of an accident in $1980 at the Indian Point nuclear power station.
No private corporation could even build a nuclear power plant. You have to have the taxpayers footing the bill.
You have to have what is called the Price-Anderson Act, having the United States government guarantee the insurance. Nobody will guarantee, nobody will sell an insurance policy for a nuclear power plant, because who can afford a $200 billion accident? That's why the United States government has underwritten the insurance for every nuclear power plant. So the Price-Anderson Act is an act of Congress that mandates the U.S. government, the taxpayers, will underwrite insurance because nuclear power stations are not insurable.